You think you're so special, don't you? She said it with a sneer, that familiar tightening around her mouth that always signaled a prelude to something I didn't want to hear. Her eyes, hard and assessing, scanned my face as if searching for a crack, a weakness she could exploit. The scent of stale cigarettes and cheap perfume hung in the air of her cramped living room, a smell I'd associated with disappointment for as long as I could remember. My usual response was a carefully practiced neutral expression, a shield I'd honed over years of navigating the emotional minefield of my family. I just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and let the silence stretch. It was my first defense, my quiet protest. My normal life was, well, it was a quiet hustle. I worked hard, built something from scratch with my own 2 hands and a healthy dose of stubbornness. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't inherited wealth. It was the slow, painstaking work of creating value, of seeing potential where others saw only dust. In contrast, my family's world was built on a foundation of inherited privilege and a deeply ingrained sense of entitlement. My father, a man of booming pronouncements and selective memory, presided over this kingdom from his armchair. My mother, perpetually draped in a fragile air of martyrdom, dutifully amplified his pronouncements. And then there was my sister, the darling of their dynasty, whose own achievements were always presented through a prism of her parents' influence. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves, the one who was always expected to be grateful for whatever crumbs were tossed my way. One memory surfaces with stark clarity. I was in my early 20s, brimming with nascent ideas for a small business. I'd meticulously drafted a business plan, pored over market research, and felt a genuine flicker of excitement. I'd presented it to my father, expecting, perhaps naively, a sliver of encouragement. He'd barely glanced at the pages, his gaze fixed on the golf scores in the morning paper. Business, eh? He'd finally grunted, his voice dismissive. Just make sure it doesn't interfere with your responsibilities. And remember, son, it's a tough world out there. Not everyone has it in them. He'd then returned to his paper, the interview over before it had truly begun. It wasn't outright rejection, but the subtle, suffocating implication that I was an amateur playing in a league far above my head, a sentiment echoed by my mother who'd later jokingly asked if I'd already blown through all my savings on this little hobby. Then there was my sister's wedding. A lavish affair, funded, of course, by my parents. I'd managed to scrape together a significant sum to buy a small, independent consultancy firm. It was a huge step for me, a validation of years of hard work. I'd wanted to share the news, to feel a sliver of pride reflected in my family's eyes. I'd called my mother, the news bubbling up inside me. She'd listened, her voice strained. "That's nice, dear," she'd said, her tone carefully devoid of enthusiasm. "But we're rather preoccupied with the wedding preparations right now. You know how much this means to your sister." The message was clear: my success, however small in their grand scheme, was an inconvenient distraction. My achievements were always secondary, always overshadowed by their manufactured drama or inherited status. The real turning point, the moment the quiet endurance shattered, happened at my father's birthday party. It was a sprawling affair, held at his sprawling estate. The air was thick with the clinking of champagne glasses and the murmur of insincere congratulations. I'd arrived a little later, wanting to avoid the initial crush. As I walked through the manicured gardens, I overheard snippets of conversation. My sister and her husband were animatedly discussing their latest extravagant purchase, a vacation home in the Hamptons. My mother was regaling a group of guests with tales of my father's supposed business acumen, exaggerating every minor success into legendary triumph. And then I heard it, my father's voice, amplified by a microphone he insisted on using for his annual address. He was talking about legacies. About building empires that spanned generations. He was talking about his sons-in-law, praising their business sense, their ambition. And then, he turned his attention to me. "And my youngest," he boomed, his voice dripping with a condescending affection that made my stomach clench, "he's always been a bit quiet. Content with his small corner of the world. We're all very proud of him, of course, for his steady approach. The words hung in the air, a meticulously crafted dismissal. Steady approach. It was code for insignificant, for unambitious, for someone who would never amount to anything noteworthy in his eyes. The laughter that followed was polite, but it felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking my skin. I saw my sister's triumphant smirk, my mother's feigned concern. In that moment, surrounded by the echoes of their dismissals and their condescending praise, the weight of years of being overlooked settled on my shoulders like a shroud. I felt a profound, chilling emptiness. The next few days were a blur of forced smiles and averted gazes. The words, steady approach, replayed in my mind, each repetition a dull thud against my resolve. I didn't rage. I didn't confront. Instead, a cold, calm clarity settled over me. The quiet endurance had been replaced by a quiet resolve. I began to make calls, to sign documents, to finalize arrangements that had been simmering on the back burner for months. It was a meticulous dismantling, a methodical unraveling. I recalled a conversation from years ago, a casual mention of an investment my father had made in a struggling tech startup, an investment he'd always spoken of as a modest philanthropic gesture, a sum he'd long written off. I'd followed that company's trajectory, its slow, improbable ascent. Through a series of discreet inquiries and legal maneuvers, I confirmed that a substantial portion of that lost investment was indeed mine, a forgotten clause in an old family trust, one that stipulated a percentage of any residual returns be directed to my personal development fund. The moment of execution was, in its own way, anticlimactic. It was a Thursday, a week after the birthday party. I drove, not to my modest apartment, but to a dealership I'd visited numerous times before, the one with the gleaming polished floors and the hushed atmosphere of wealth. The sales manager, a man who'd initially treated me with a practiced politeness reserved for serious buyers, now looked at me with a newfound respect, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He'd seen the paperwork, the confirmation of funds. He knew. I pointed to the car, a sleek, obsidian black beauty that seemed to hum with quiet power. That one, I said, my voice steady. I'll take it. Later that afternoon, I drove to my parents' estate. It was a sunny Saturday, the kind of day they loved to host impromptu gatherings. As I pulled up the long, winding driveway, the usual crowd was milling about on the lawn, their faces illuminated by the afternoon sun. Conversations hushed as I drove past them, the crunch of gravel under my tires the loudest sound. I parked, not in the designated guest parking, but directly in front of the imposing oak doors, the engine idling with a low, resonant purr. I turned off the ignition, the sudden silence amplifying the stunned stares. My father emerged from the house, his usual jovial expression faltering. My mother appeared beside him, her hand flying to her chest. My sister, still in her party dress, her eyes wide with disbelief, stepped forward. The car wasn't just a car. It was a statement. It was a tangible representation of years of ignored potential, of dismissed ambition, of a quiet resilience they had underestimated for so long. It was the culmination of my steady approach. The quiet satisfaction wasn't in their shock, but in the dawning realization on their faces, the slow crumpling of their smug certainty. My father's mouth opened, then closed. My sister's triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The silence that descended was profound, heavy with the weight of their misjudgment. The aftermath was a symphony of frantic text messages and awkward phone calls. My mother, bless her dramatic heart, immediately declared herself shocked and saddened by my unnecessary ostentation, conveniently forgetting her own pronouncements about my small corner of the world. My sister, the ever-loyal flying monkey, sent a barrage of texts accusing me of showing off and being attention-seeking. My father, for the first time in my memory, was rendered speechless, unable to craft a pronouncement or deliver a judgment. The whispers started, of course. The inevitable gossip mill churning out tales of a sudden windfall, of a secret inheritance. But they didn't know the quiet, calculated effort that had gone into it. They didn't understand the years of being written off, of being told, subtly and not so subtly, that I was less. The true consequence, however, was more personal, more devastating to their carefully constructed image of themselves. My father, the man who equated worth with visible wealth and public pronouncements, was confronted with the fact that his own son, the one he deemed steady, had achieved a level of financial independence and success that he, in his pronouncements, had never quite managed to secure for himself, at least not without the benefit of his father's name. My sister, whose life had been a testament to inherited privilege, was forced to witness her brother's independent triumph, a triumph that had nothing to do with parental handouts. The quiet of my success, the sleek elegance of the car parked in F. front of their ostentatious home, was a far more potent message than any shouted accusation. It was a cold, grounded reflection. They had underestimated me. They had ignored my quiet work, my steady progress. And in their arrogance, they had allowed me to build something substantial, something real, something that finally spoke louder than their words. The silence that followed was, for me, the sweetest sound.